It was one of those Oxford mornings when the rain does not so much fall as hover a thin, deliberate mist that confuses windows and thoughts alike. From my rooms above St. Giles, I watched the street lamps blur themselves into abstraction as if the city were reluctant to be seen clearly. I've often wondered if Oxford prefers her mysteries to remain unsolved. Perhaps that is why I stayed. The day had begun with nothing but the comfort of habit, a crossword unfinished, a tepid cup of tea, and a low ache behind my eyes that I had come to trust more than intuition. Somewhere below, the bells of St. Mary Magdalene marked the hour in tones that seemed less like time and more like memory. Lewis had been late, of course. He always was when the weather turned sentimental. He arrived damp and apologetic, his coat exuding the smell of rain and tobacco. "There's been something at St. Benedict's College, sir." A porter found a body by the chapel. He said it as though it were a misplaced parcel. Death, I have learned, has no interest in drama. It prefers quiet corners, locked doors, and early mornings. We drove there in near silence, past the pale facades of colleges that had outlived their own ideals. I remember thinking how the city seemed to breathe differently on days like that. Slower, cautious, aware of its own weight. Lewis filled the air with small talk about football scores and a nephew's exams, as if to remind us both that the living still existed. At St. Benedict's, the porter waited beneath the dripping eaves, a man built for silence. He led us to the chapel's side door, fumbling with keys that rattled like teeth. The body lay just inside, half in shadow, half illuminated by the uncertain light that filtered through stained glass. A man, middle-aged, with the resigned posture of someone long accustomed to solitude. His face was turned toward the pews, as though expecting a sermon that never came. I crouched beside him, noting the small, deliberate details, the undone cufflink, the ink stain near the thumb, the faint scent of lavender too deliberate for a man of his years and profession. There was also a note on the stone step beside him, folded once, precisely. It contained a single word: regret. Lewis shifted uneasily. Suicide, then? I told him, perhaps, though the word had not yet earned its certainty. The man's shoes were polished to a degree of vanity that did not suit despair. The college chaplain appeared, whispering apologies as if to God. He spoke of the deceased Dr. Alan Trevor, fellow in classical studies, recently returned from sabbatical. A good man, he said. Quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. The sort who noticed the dust in libraries but never complained. I asked when he was last seen. Yesterday evening, just after evensong. He had borrowed a volume from the library, Euripides' The Fragments. A curious choice for a man so weary of words. Outside, the rain had thickened into a kind of confession. The stone path glistened like polished bone. I remember pausing beneath the archway, looking back at the chapel door and thinking how death always manages to look rehearsed in Oxford, the setting too perfect, the silence too practiced. On the way back, Lewis asked if I believed in coincidence. Only in crosswords, I said. Yet even then, something small had begun to whisper in the back of my mind, a pattern not yet visible but insisting on its own existence. The undone cufflink, the lavender, the single word regret. They did not speak of despair. They spoke of design. That evening, as the city folded itself into its customary solitude, I walked again along St. Giles. The lamplight trembled on wet pavement, and somewhere in the distance a piano was practicing Chopin, hesitant, unresolved. I thought of Dr. Trevor, of Euripides, of the ancient chorus that mourned but never understood. And I wondered, not for the first time, whether understanding was ever the point. I poured myself a measure of whiskey and watched the amber settle like truth in a glass. The case, I knew, would not end where it had begun. It never did. Oxford has a way of ensuring that every answer demands another question. Outside, the rain continued to be patient, precise, and oddly consoling. the kind of rain that makes one believe that somewhere, beyond the blurred horizon of a memory, a pattern might finally reveal itself. And yet, even now, I am not sure I wish it had. I've often thought that Oxford breeds a certain kind of death, polite, well-read, and painfully aware of its surroundings, the sort that arrives not in anger, but in footnotes. Dr. Alan Trevor's passing seemed to belong to that order, deliberate, learned, and faintly embarrassed by its own occurrence. Lewis had been reading the preliminary report aloud in his patient, northern way, as we sat in the canteen at HQ. Cause of death: cyanide ingestion. Time of death approximately 10:45 p.m. No signs of struggle. I could almost see the coroner's pen lingering, uncertain whether to write suicide or accident. I remember stirring my tea long after the sugar had dissolved, watching the swirl tighten into nothing. Cyanide, I said finally, is not the choice of a weary scholar. It's theatrical. Ancient. There was a pause, and Lewis looked at me the way one looks at a man who has mistaken philosophy for fact. We returned to St. Benedict's that afternoon. The sky had cleared with a kind of irony, and the air had that crisp, paper-dry sharpness particular to Oxford after rain. The college quad was almost too quiet, as though rehearsed for morning. A blackbird perched on a sundial, untroubled by human consequence. The college librarian, a woman with the pallor of old parchment, received us in whispers. She told us that Trevor had borrowed only one book the previous evening, Euripides again. I asked whether it had been returned. It hadn't. She led us to his rooms on a narrow staircase, the smell of polish and pipe smoke still clinging to the banister. Inside, the air was dry and meticulous. Everything arranged with the austerity of a man who trusted order more than comfort. Books lined the shelves in predictable symmetry. Greek on the top, Latin below. On the desk, a glass still half filled with water. I noticed beside it the faint indentation of a ring on the wood, the sort made by a cup recently removed. Lewis was rummaging through the drawers, his hands careful but curious. He found a letter addressed to the college bursar, unsealed, unfinished. I read the first few lines. It began as an apology, but the rest dissolved into hesitation, words scratched out, rewritten, abandoned. I stood by the window, watching a group of undergraduates crossing the quad below, laughing with the carelessness that only youth permits. One of them carried a bouquet of chrysanthemums, a small, almost comic touch of color against the academic grayness. Flowers in October. For decoration, perhaps, or remembrance. I asked the librarian whether Dr. Trevor had any visitors the night he died. She hesitated, then said she thought she heard voices around 10. Male, perhaps, or perhaps an echo from the stairwell. Oxford stairwells are full of echoes. They collect gossip and grief with equal impartiality. Lewis mentioned that the note found beside the body, regret, had been typed, not handwritten. A curious detail, easily dismissed by those in search of a convenient suicide. Trevor's typewriter sat on the desk, a battered Olivetti, ribbon frayed. I pressed one of the keys to the letter R and saw that it caught slightly, producing a faint smudge on the paper. It matched the one on the note. But something about the spacing was wrong. Too neat, too deliberate. The kind of tidiness that belongs to forgery, not despair. We found the missing cup later, a porcelain mug placed carefully inside the sink, rinsed but not washed. The faint almond scent of cyanide lingered beneath the surface. Suicide, then, Lewis said again, his voice heavy with doubt rather than conviction. Perhaps, I replied. But if so, he was considerate enough to clean up after himself. That evening, I walked alone through Jericho, where the smell of autumn fires mixed with the faint metallic tang of the canal. The city, as ever, offered no answers, only reflections that refused to stay still. Somewhere, a church bell struck 8, though it might as well have been midnight. I thought of Trevor's word, regret. A confession, perhaps, or an accusation. The sort of word a scholar might use when meaning something entirely different. I have learned to trust such words. They tell you less about what happened and more about how someone wished to be remembered. When I returned to my flat, the rain had begun again, gentle, unrepentant, whispering against the glass as if repeating a story it had told before. I poured another whiskey and sat by the window, letting the city blur itself into abstraction once more. Cyanide, I murmured to myself, ancient and theatrical. The kind of death that wants to be seen. But Oxford, as always, prefers to look away. There are certain buildings in Oxford that seem to breathe differently from the rest, not with air, but with history. St. Benedict's was one of those enclosed, immaculate, and faintly airless, like something kept under glass for too long. It was a place where sound hesitated before traveling, where every footstep seemed preordained. I had been in hundreds of colleges before, but that morning the silence pressed against my chest like a held breath. The college authorities had decided, in their infinite academic decorum, to resume normality as quickly as possible. The chapel was locked, the students kept politely uninformed, and the deceased, Dr. Alan Trevor, was already fading into a cautionary anecdote about stress and solitude. Oxford tidies its tragedies quickly. It dislikes disorder more than death. Lewis and I were shown into the senior common room by the sub-warden, a man whose beard seemed to have been grown for the purpose of solemnity. He poured coffee with monastic precision, explaining that the college had been under financial strain, donations dwindling, lectures thinly attended, and certain benefactors growing disenchanted. He said all this as though it excused something. It rarely does. I noticed a painting above the fireplace of the college itself, rendered in watercolor, sunlight touching every stone. The artist had made one curious mistake. The chapel door, the one where Trevor had been found, was missing entirely, as though erased. I asked who had painted it. A former student, the sub-warden said. Expelled. Artistic temperament. He smiled thinly, the kind of smile that knew too much to be sincere. Afterwards, I walked alone through the quadrangle. The glass of the windows reflected the pale October sky so perfectly that the world seemed to doubt the college and its ghost staring back at one another. I have always mistrusted perfection. It hides too much beneath its surface. At the far end of the garden, near a row of yew trees, I found the groundskeeper repairing a stone path. His hands were large, expressionless things, and he spoke without looking at me. Terrible business, sir. He'd been keeping to himself lately. I asked if he meant Trevor. He nodded. Said the man used to walk here most nights, muttering in Greek, as if reciting some private penance. Then he added something strange that a week before his death, Trevor had buried something beneath the sundial. A keepsake, perhaps. Or guilt, if such things could be interred. Lewis arrived just as I knelt to inspect the earth. There was no mark, no sign of recent digging, but the ground was slightly raised, as though a single breath had been caught beneath the soil. Lewis suggested we get permission before disturbing anything. I told him permission was the least reliable of virtues. We unearthed a small tin box, the kind once used for tobacco. Inside, there was a photograph, faded, creased, and unmistakably intimate. Two men, young, seated beside the college pond, their faces turned toward one another in laughter. Trevor was one of them, the other I could not yet name. Back in my flat that evening, I placed the photograph under the lamp. The image trembled faintly under the heat, the way memory does when held too close. I noticed something I had missed before a blurred reflection in the water behind them. A third figure, half caught, standing in the reeds. Watching. It was a small thing, but it shifted the air around the case. Not a suicide then, but a conversation cut short. An unfinished sentence. I'd seen it before, the way people hide meaning behind civility, pain behind syntax. Trevor's final note, regret, might not have been about himself at all. I thought again of the painting in the common room, the chapel door erased, as though the artist had wished to pretend the scene of death did not exist. Perhaps the college itself preferred the same illusion that nothing terrible could happen within its walls, that every tragedy belonged to the past. Oxford, after all, survives by the art of forgetting. Outside, the evening light was thinning, the streets turning the color of pewter. Through the window, I could see the spire of St. Mary's like a needle piercing the sky. Somewhere, a choir was practicing fragments of Latin drifting through the cold air, words that spoke of salvation but sounded to me more like longing. I poured myself another whiskey, though it did little to warm me. The photograph lay on the desk, patient, inscrutable. In the reflection of the glass, I could just make out my own face beside Trevor's two men staring into something they could never quite name. And even now, I'm unsure which of us was watching whom. I met her 3 days after Trevor's death in the stillness of a drawing room that seemed composed more of shadows than air. Mrs. Eleanor Trevor, the widow. The term itself always felt to me less a title than a verdict. Her house was on Park Town, one of those crescent terraces that pretends not to care about the past, but cannot help living in it. The curtains were half drawn, the light reluctant. A faint smell of lilies lingered, the funereal sort that makes grief seem rehearsed. She sat by the fire, her hands folded around a cup of tea she did not drink. Lewis waited in the car, his patience already thinning beneath the weight of respectability. I had told him this visit required quiet, not questions. I remember her face not young, not old, but worn smooth by endurance. There was no sign of tears. Grief, when genuine, rarely advertises itself. She spoke first. "You've come to ask about Alan." It wasn't a question, merely an observation. I told her that we were trying to understand what had happened, though I doubted anyone truly could. She smiled faintly at a scholar's wife, well acquainted with the limits of comprehension. "He was not a happy man," she said, "but unhappiness does not explain everything. Some people carry sadness like others carry spectacles to see more clearly." I asked when she had last seen him, 2 weeks before his death. He had called in the evening from the college. His voice, she said, had been softer than usual. He had asked about the cat, about the weather, nothing important, and yet everything was. She had known, somehow, that he was saying goodbye. On the mantelpiece there was a photograph of the same man, younger, beside the same woman, smiling into a summer that no longer existed. I noticed a small scratch on the glass, deliberate rather than accidental, crossing his face just below the eyes. I said nothing, but it stayed with me. I asked whether her husband had any close friends at the college. She hesitated. "There was one," she said finally. "A colleague in the classics faculty, Dr. Patrick Vale. They'd worked together years ago. Fell out over something trivial. A book, perhaps. Or something that pretended to be a book." She gave a small, dismissive shrug, but the tremor in her hand betrayed the weight of the memory. When she rose to pour more tea, I noticed an unopened envelope on the side table, addressed in her husband's hand. No stamp. The paper was old, the kind used in college correspondence, faintly yellow, faintly accusing. She followed my eyes, and for the first time her voice hardened. "He wrote that the night before he died. I cannot open it." I did not ask why. The living often refuse what the dead intend them to read. Instead, I asked whether her husband had ever mentioned a photograph of him by the pond. Her reaction was slight, but there was a breath caught too early. She said no. Then, after a pause, "Perhaps." Alan was sentimental about the past. He liked to keep proof of it as though memory were not enough. The fire crackled faintly. A clock in the hall marked each second with the indifference of habit. I remember thinking that her silence was not grief's silence, but complicity's a quiet born of knowing too much or too well. When I left, she followed me to the door. The lily's perfume had thickened in the heat. "Be kind," she said softly. He was not made for cruelty. The words sounded like both pleas and warnings. Outside, the air had turned brittle with frost. I lit a cigarette and watched the smoke rise against the pale light. Lewis asked how she seemed. I told him she seemed like a woman who had survived something long before her husband died. He frowned, but didn't press. Later, back in my room, I thought of that unopened letter. A message withheld, perhaps not meant for her at all. The scratch across the photograph's glass, too precise to be chance. The small detail that the lilies had not been bought, but delivered their card discreetly removed. Oxford is a city of silences, but hers was of a particular kind, cultivated, almost sacred. I have learned that what is not said often screams the loudest. That night, as I sat with the crossword half finished and the whiskey glass half empty, I found myself writing one word in the margin beside a clue I could not solve. It was not an answer, but it felt close. Guilt. It was in the college chapel that I began, reluctantly, to understand. Not the crime. Not yet those things never yield so early, but the tone of deceit that hung in the air like incense after the service had ended. The candles had burned low, their wax folded upon itself in pale exhaustion. A hymn book lay open on the front pew, "Abide with me," underlined faintly in pencil. A confession, perhaps, from someone who believed in music more than in mercy. The chaplain was waiting for me. A tall man, brittle, with the half-starved look of one whose faith had been trimmed into doctrine. He had known Trevor for years, he said, and the conversation turned quickly, too quickly to sin. Trevor was troubled, he murmured, but not in the way people imagine. It wasn't despair that killed him, it was the truth. There was something rehearsed in the way he spoke, as though grief had been memorized from Scripture. I asked whether he had seen Trevor the night of his death. Yes, briefly, outside the vestry. He'd come to return a key, he said. Odd thing, really. It was the master key to the college library. Lewis, standing behind me, shifted his weight impatiently. He never cared much for the elliptical poetry of clergymen. But I found myself tracing the line of dust on the windowsill, noting how one corner was wiped clean of a small square of absence, as if someone had placed a book there not long ago. Trevor had borrowed Euripides' The Fragments. The librarian swore it hadn't been returned. And yet that patch of dust suggested otherwise. I pointed it out, and the chaplain frowned, his certainty briefly disturbed. Perhaps, he said, perhaps he brought it back that evening. Perhaps he meant to. Meaning to do something, I told him, is not the same as doing it. He smiled thinly. You of all men should know that. Outside, the bells began again, scattering sound like broken glass across the quad. I watched the students passing in their gowns, heads bowed not in reverence but exhaustion. There's a strange sanctity to fatigue, I've found. It allows a man to mistake surrender for peace. We walked across the courtyard to the library. The porter unlocked the door with bureaucratic reluctance, his hands trembling slightly. Inside, the air was heavy with the perfume of old bindings, the faint sweetness of dust. There is no smell quite like the scent of knowledge rotting beautifully. On the librarian's desk, I found a ledger of borrowed texts. Trevor's name was entered for Euripides a week before his death, but below it, in another hand, was a note returned 10 p.m., initials P.V. Patrick Vale. The handwriting was cramped, deliberate. Vale had denied seeing Trevor that night. I had asked him directly the day before, in his rooms, over the clatter of an ill-tuned piano. He had smiled, the kind of smile that mistakes charm for innocence, and said no, he'd been marking essays until midnight. But here was his name, or rather, his disguise. PV. Not signed out of courtesy but necessity, lies, like theology, often depend on interpretation. Lewis asked what it meant. I told him, perhaps nothing, or everything. It was the sort of deduction that pleased him least, the kind that couldn't yet be proven. He muttered something about coincidences, and I let him. He has never trusted ambiguity. I, on the other hand, have always found faithful company. Later that evening I returned to the chapel. The candles had been replaced, the hymn book closed. Yet the faint smell of sulphur lingered. Someone had been there after us. I noticed the lectern slightly askew, the Bible open not to the Psalms, but to the book of John, chapter 8, verse 32. And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. It was underlined in the same faint pencil. I stood there a long while, listening to the echo of my own breath, wondering whose freedom the verse had purchased. When I left, Oxford was wrapped again in its habitual silence, the kind that neither accuses nor forgives. The street lamps flickered through the fog like hesitant thoughts. I walked back toward St. Giles, my coat collar turned up against the drizzle, and found myself whispering the verse aloud. Truth, I said to no one, never makes anyone free. It only exchanges one set of chains for another. And that night, alone with a crossword I couldn't finish and a glass I shouldn't have refilled, I understood that theology and deceit are not so far apart. Both depend, after all, on faith and on the silence that follows belief. It was Lewis who brought me the letter. Folded, rain-marked, the envelope slightly torn as though opened in haste. He found it in the chaplain's office, he said, among the papers marked confidential. I asked why he'd been rummaging in another man's drawers. He said curiosity, which is what the police like to call disobedience when it proves useful. The handwriting was Trevor's. I knew instantly the tidy slope of a man accustomed to annotation, every letter disciplined, unhurried, exact. But the ink told a different story. Too dark, too recent. It had been copied, not written. A confession rewritten. The words themselves were sparse. He spoke of remorse, of a mistake beyond forgiveness, of truth cloaked in silence. There was mention of betrayal, one word underlined twice. Beneath it, the date of his death. Lewis read it once, then again. So that's it, then. The man admits it, guilt and all. I told him confessions are like sermons meant to persuade, not to prove. We drove to the college. The morning had the faint gold of early frost, and the air smelled of iron and decay. In the quad, a maintenance man was sweeping leaves into careful, hopeless piles. I've always liked the sound of something trying to impose order on the inevitable. In the chaplain's office, I studied the typewriter. A modern one, electric, its hum still faintly audible. The ribbon was new. A fresh one was installed just yesterday, according to the secretary. But there, beneath the wastebasket, were 2 torn sheets of discarded drafts of the same letter. Same phrasing, different signatures. The first bore Trevor's name, the second, Vale's. The chaplain entered quietly, too quietly, and said we were trespassing on sanctity. I told him sanctity, like secrecy, rarely survives scrutiny. He smiled thinly. You don't understand confession, Inspector. It is meant to cleanse. I told him it was also meant to conceal. He spoke of Trevor again as a man of pride, capable of deception but never malice. I asked whether he believed Trevor had taken his own life. He paused. Faith allows for mystery, he said. I told him murder often does too. As we left, I caught sight of a student watching us from the cloister, tall, pale, the kind of boy who looks as though he reads more than he sleeps. He turned away when I met his gaze. Lewis muttered that I was imagining things. I told him, perhaps, though imagination was what Oxford was built on. Back in my room that evening, I compared the confession to Trevor's earlier writings, essays, marginal notes, and letters to the college bursar. The rhythm was wrong. Trevor wrote like a man in dialogue with himself, hesitant, self-correcting. This letter was too clean, too fluent. It lacked hesitation. And guilt, I've always thought, hesitates. Then I saw a detail almost too small to trust. In all his letters, Trevor used an em dash, never a colon. Here, every sentence has been divided neatly, precisely, by colons. A priest's punctuation, not a scholar's. Lewis called it coincidence. I called it the handwriting of the soul. I returned to the chapel late that night. The doors were unlocked, the air heavy with the scent of extinguished candles. On the lectern, a new page lay ready for the next sermon, perhaps, or a draft thereof. I recognized the same paper, the same typeface, the same colons. The chaplain's sermon was titled, "The Forgiveness of Others." I folded the page into my coat pocket and left without switching on the light. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint tolling of a bell from some unseen tower. The sound reached me in pieces, like a thought one cannot quite form. That night, I dreamt of Trevor not as he had died, but as he might once have lived. Writing in the dim glow of a library lamp, surrounded by silence so complete it seemed to hum. I could almost hear the scratch of his pen, the small sigh of each line finished, and over it, the whisper of another voice dictating. When I woke, the city was still, the sky a bruised gray. I poured a whiskey I didn't need and looked again at the forged confession on my desk. Words borrowed to bury truth. I thought of the chaplain, of his voice like velvet drawn across stone, and wondered whether, in his theology, deception might pass for mercy. Some confessions cleanse the soul. Others stain it more deeply. The trouble, I suppose, lies in knowing which is which. The word martyr has always troubled me. It implies choice, but rarely honesty. Oxford has known its share of men who preferred reputation to truth and sacrifice to confession. Dr. Patrick Vale, I suspected, belonged comfortably among their number. I found him that morning in his room at St. Benedict's, a book of sermons open before him, though I doubted he'd been reading. The piano was closed, the keys gathering dust, as if silence had become a kind of devotion. He offered me coffee, the academic gesture of civility that disguises dread. I declined. He said he'd heard rumors of forged letters, of a confession that might not have been Trevor's. His eyes, a pale gray that reflected nothing, remained fixed on me. Lies, like guilt, prefer eye contact. I asked where he had been the night of Trevor's death. He gave me the same answer as before, with the same rhythm. Marking essays until midnight. I told him that one of those essays, the one by his favorite pupil, contained a curious phrase, the silence of Euripides. The same phrase appeared in the forged confession. Coincidence, perhaps. But Oxford lives on coincidence. It builds its theology upon it. He smiled that soft, unrepentant smile of the clever, guilty man. If I believed every echo, he said, I'd have no silence left to pray in. Lewis, who had been inspecting the room with the heavy-footed curiosity of a man out of place, noted a framed photograph on the mantel. Vale and Trevor, younger, arm in arm beside the college pond. I had seen the image before, in its other version, the one buried beneath the sundial, where a third figure had lingered in reflection. Here, the water had been cropped out entirely. Erased, as if the past could be trimmed to fit a new narrative. When we left, the air outside seemed colder than it had any right to be. The clouds had gathered in the kind of disciplined formation that only winter understands. Lewis muttered that Vale was hiding something. I told him everyone was. The trick was deciding whether it mattered. That evening I returned to the chapel alone. The door was ajar, the lamps unlit. A single candle burned at the front, its flame shivering against the draught. Someone had placed a folded paper beneath the lectern. I picked it up. A sermon, unsigned. The title, on the necessity of suffering. I read the first line, "No man dies for truth, he dies for what he wishes it to be." The words had Vale's cadence, the same careful ambiguity he cultivated in speech. I had heard it before, in his lectures, in his polite evasions. I imagined him there, the night Trevor died, the two of them speaking in the chapel's half-light. Not a quarrel, perhaps, but a reckoning. Back at my flat, I laid the sermon beside the forged confession, the same ribbon of syntax, the same habit of division by colons, the same silence where sentiment should have been. Lewis came by later, bearing takeaway and impatience. He said we had no proof that everything was conjecture, inference, or Oxford smoke. I told him smoke was only proof that something once burned. He asked, almost plaintively, what I thought had happened between them. I poured him a whiskey and said that friendship, when starved of honesty, ferments into envy. That some love curdle when denied the dignity of their own name. He looked at me as though I had spoken Greek, and perhaps I had. After he left, I sat for a long time without light. The city was still awake, footsteps echoing faintly from St. Giles's, a bicycle chain rattling against the wet stone. I thought of Vale's calm face, of Trevor's lonely end, of the woman in Parktown who refused to open a letter addressed to her by the dead. Each of them performs their parts with academic restraint, each of them worshipping their own version of truth. Before sleeping, I glanced once more at the photograph. In the dark reflection of my window, their faces seemed to float beside mine, 3 men divided by silence, united by the faint suggestion of remorse. Martyrs, I thought, are not born. They are edited, and in Oxford, editing has always been the purest form of faith. The chapel was full that morning, the curious, the devout, and those who could not quite tell the difference. Rain had driven them in, perhaps, or conscience. I sat near the back, behind a row of students who smelled faintly of wool and fear. The organ hummed like a throat-clearing for confession. Dr. Vale stood at the lectern. His voice carried the measured calm of a man used to being believed. The sermon was titled, "The Cost of Truth," a familiar phrase borrowed from Trevor's own essays, though I doubted anyone else in the room would have recognized it. He began softly, speaking of temptation, of the small dishonesties that gather like dust until one can no longer see the glass beneath. There was no mention of Trevor by name, but the air was thick with his absence. I watched the chaplain seated to one side, his hands clasped too tightly, his face a portrait of devout discomfort. Lewis shifted beside me, impatient already. He whispered that we were wasting time. I told him to listen not to the words, but to the pauses between them. "That's where truth hides," I said. Halfway through, Vale spoke to Judas of the need to betray the strange mercy in it. His tone faltered just once, on the word mercy, as though it caught in his throat. I saw him glance briefly toward the organ loft, where the widow, Mrs. Trevor, sat beneath her black hat, unblinking. When the service ended, the congregation filed out in that polite shuffle peculiar to the English middle class, unwilling to linger, but unable to leave quickly enough. I stayed seated. The organ began again, low and uncertain, like a question repeated too often. Vale descended from the pulpit. Our eyes met briefly, the quiet acknowledgement of 2 men who have read the same unsent letter. He paused near the altar rail. "You came for absolution, Inspector, not evidence," he said. I told him the two were rarely distinct. Lewis and I followed him to his rooms. The corridors of St. Benedict's were wet with condensation, the kind that magnifies footsteps. Inside, the fire burned too brightly for the hour. Vale removed his gown with unnecessary care, folded it, and placed it over the arm of a chair. He poured whiskey for himself, then remembered I drank the same. The glass trembled slightly in his hand, not from fear, I thought, but from memory. He asked if I believed Trevor had killed himself. I said I believed in the possibility of despair, but not in convenience. He smiled. We all prefer complex crimes, don't we, Inspector? Simple ones leave us nothing to think about. Lewis asked about the forged confession. Vale's eyes flickered toward the desk where his typewriter sat, its carriage still dusted with ash from the last cigarette he'd stubbed out. He said it was absurd that anyone could have copied a man's words. Then he added, almost gently, that some truths deserve to be rewritten. It was then I noticed the small burn mark on his sleeve was a perfect circle, too clean to be accidental, the same diameter as a candle base. I remembered the night I'd found the single candle lit in the empty chapel, its flame trembling as though disturbed. I asked him whether he often wrote sermons by candlelight. He did not answer, but his hand moved instinctively to cover the mark. Silence is its own confession. When we left, Lewis muttered that he was guilty as sin. I told him guilt was not always proof, and sin not always crime. He gave me the look of a man who has run out of patience with philosophy. That evening I walked past the chapel once more. The doors were closed, the windows clouded with rain. I could just make out a figure inside, kneeling at the altar. Vale, perhaps, or the chaplain, or conscience itself, performing its endless ritual of apology. Back in my flat, I listened to the rain trace its patterns down the glass. I opened my notebook and wrote 3 words: mercy, betrayal, light. They seemed related somehow, though not in any theological sense. I thought of the sermon of Vale's voice trembling only once, and only at mercy. A man can admit sin without confessing it. He can even sanctify it if he's clever enough. And Vale was nothing if not clever. Outside, the bells began again, echoing through the soaked streets, reminding Oxford that forgiveness, like rain, is never evenly distributed. I returned to St. Benedict's library at dusk, when the light slants low enough to expose dust in the air to the particles of old arguments and forgotten prayers. There's something about libraries at that hour, when even the books seem to withdraw from view, as if ashamed of what they contain. The porter looked startled to see me again. He said the college had been trying to forget the whole business, and that I'd do well to let the dead alone. I told him that the dead rarely return the favor. Inside, the place smelled of parchment and damp wool. The air was colder than it ought to have been. I moved toward the lectern near the back, where Trevor had once worked. The copy of Euripides' The Fragments was there at last, neatly shelved as though it had never strayed. I pulled it down carefully. Its spine cracked like a sigh. A note fell from between the pages, not the first I'd found, but the first that felt like it wanted to be discovered. The paper was thin, the ink faint. Only a few words he said there would be mercy in it. No signature, no date. Lewis arrived not long after, carrying 2 cups of coffee that had gone cold by the time he'd navigated the college bureaucracy. He stood behind me, reading over my shoulder. He said it sounded like confession again. I said it sounded like justification. There's a difference, though not one theology cares to make. We took the note back to my flat, where I laid it under the lamp beside the earlier letter, the forged confession. The handwriting was similar, but not the same. There was hesitation here, a tremor at the start of each word. Fear, not imitation. I thought of the widow, of her trembling hands around the teacup. The scent of lilies came back uninvited. Lewis asked what I thought. I told him I thought someone had written it twice, once to be read and once to be believed. He frowned, not following. I said that the truth, like Scripture, often depends on who reads it second. Later, I walked back toward the college, the streets glistening from rain that had no intention of stopping. In the porter's lodge, a light burned low. A woman sat behind the desk of the night clerk, filling in for the usual man. She had the tired eyes of someone who'd spent her life overhearing things she wasn't meant to. I asked whether she'd ever seen Dr. Vale come in after hours. She hesitated, then said yes, often. He'd use the library at night, always alone. Once, she'd found him standing at the chapel door long past midnight, holding something that looked like a manuscript. He said it was a sermon, though he'd been weeping. The next morning, I returned to the chapel to see what remained of him. The air still held the faint aroma of extinguished wax. On the pulpit, a new sheet of paper, the second reading. I recognized the title before I reached it for the sermon to be delivered that Sunday. Vale's name at the top, and below, a passage that felt eerily familiar. There are 2 readings of every truth, one to comfort the living, and one to absolve the dead. It wasn't theology. It was confession, rewritten yet again, polished until meaning had become disguised. I traced the lines with my thumb and realized what had been troubling me since the beginning. Not from the library's Olivetti, nor the chaplain's machine, but older, heavier, a manual font from a Remington I'd once seen in Vale's rooms. He'd copied everything. Trevor's note, his confession, his death. Lewis found me there. Still reading, he asked if it meant what I thought it did. I told him I no longer trusted what I thought. The college bell struck the hour, breaking the silence into neat, symmetrical pieces. That evening, I sat by the window and poured a measure of whiskey, the last of the bottle. The note lay beside me, the ink catching the lamplight like the residue of guilt. I tried reading it again, then once more, aloud. The words changed each time, or perhaps I did. He said there would be mercy in it. I wondered whether mercy was ever meant for the living. The rain continued without rhythm, tracing slow rivulets down the glass. Somewhere, a church bell faltered mid-stroke, its echo swallowed by the fog. I thought of Trevor, of Vale, of all the careful words left behind for others to misread, and for the first time I felt I understood why the ancients wrote on stone, because paper remembers too much. It was late November when the case slipped quietly from the present into the past. Oxford had begun its slow retreat into winter rain, flattening the last of the leaves against the cobblestones, the river swollen and muttering beneath the bridges. The city seemed older then, stripped of color, the way truth appears once the embellishments have fallen away. Lewis and I walked through Broad Street that morning, the air carrying the faint smell of smoke and wet stone. Tourists had gathered near the Martyrs Memorial, reading the plaques with reverence they didn't quite understand. They took photographs, smiled solemnly, and moved on. Oxford is good at grief, provided it comes with a guidebook. The memorial itself, that ornate imitation of piety, always struck me as too ornate, too polished for what it represented. 3 men burned alive for believing the wrong thing about God. Martyrs, they called them, though I've often thought the word is simply a way of making someone else's suffering more palatable. Lewis stood looking up at the statues. He said they were brave men, and I didn't argue. Bravery, after all, is easier to admire than motive. I told him the truth, when held too tightly, turns to ash. He looked at me, puzzled, and said I sounded like a sermon. I said perhaps I'd been listening to too many of them. We went to see the widow one final time. Her house was quieter now, the lilies replaced by chrysanthemums. She seemed lighter somehow, unburdened by the kind of knowledge that only destroys in private. She said the college had held a memorial for her husband, brief and dignified. The chaplain had read from Corinthians, something about charity enduring all things. I wondered if the man believed it himself. She told me she'd finally opened the letter, the one her husband had written before his death. I asked if it said what she expected. She said it said nothing at all. Blank paper, no ink, just his signature at the bottom, as though to confirm his silence. I asked to see it, and she let me. The page was indeed empty, except for the name, faintly pressed by a pen that had run dry, but beneath it, under the right light, I saw the faint impression of another word, a single one, barely legible. Veil. When I handed it back, she said she was keeping it not as proof, but as peace. I envied her for that distinction. Lewis drove us back through the drizzle. The wipers beat their slow metronome of futility. He asked what it meant. The name, the silence, the empty letter. I told him it meant that truth, like guilt, often leaves no evidence but its echo. He said I hadn't answered the question, and I told him I rarely do. Later that evening, I walked alone through Radcliffe Square. The lamps burned low and the cobbles shone like wet slate. A choir was rehearsing somewhere beyond the All Souls' Gate, a hymn carried faintly on the wind, words lost, melody intact. It reminded me of the sound inside a confession, the way voices echo when one tries to speak forgiveness into stone. I thought of Trevor, of Vale, of the chaplain whose faith had blurred into convenience, of Mrs. Trevor, who had mistaken silence for love. Each of them a kind of martyr in their own right, not to faith, but to the illusions they refused to surrender. Oxford produces such people with ease. It teaches them how to die beautifully, but not how to live truthfully. When I returned to my flat, I poured the last of the whiskey into a chipped glass and sat by the window. The city lay beneath a drizzle so fine it seemed like smoke. Across the street, a student hurried under an umbrella, clutching a book to his chest as though protecting it from time itself. On my desk lay the note from Euripides' The Fragments, still folded where I'd left it. He said there would be mercy in it. I read it again, though I no longer believed in mercy. Then I turned the note over and began to write a few words of my own, not for evidence, not for memory, but because I feared that silence might one day forget me too. Some truths survive not because they are believed, but because they refuse to be buried. Outside, the bells of St. Mary's began their slow toll for evensong, their echoes crossing the dark like measured repentance. I listened until the last sound faded not into peace, but into something colder, older, and far more honest. It was weeks before I could return to St. Benedict's without feeling that peculiar unease which lingers after unfinished music. The case, if that's what it still was, had dissolved into rumor. Reports were filed, conclusions drawn, and yet nothing in me had concluded. The truth, like the city itself, refused to settle. It hovered somewhere between fog and recollection. Lewis said I should leave it. He said the file was closed, the dead were buried, the living uncooperative. I told him that the silence that follows a case is sometimes louder than the case itself. He thought I meant guilt. I didn't correct him. Oxford in December is not a city, but a cathedral of breath. The mist sits on the cobbles like thought unspoken. The bells ring without echo. And everywhere there's that faint, persistent scent of cold stone as if the very air had remembered grief. I walked through the quad of St. Benedict's one evening, long after the students had gone home for Christmas. The windows of the chapel glowed faintly from within, a single candle burning on the altar. I don't know who lit it. Perhaps no one. Some places keep their own vigil. The porter nodded when I passed. He had the look of a man who had begun to forget what the tragedy was about, only that one had occurred. I envied him. Forgetting is the nearest thing to forgiveness most of us will ever know. Inside the chapel, the air was close, faintly perfumed with beeswax. The silence was absolute, not the absence of sound, but its refinement. I sat in the back pew. The candlelight trembled across the brass plaques, the names of the long dead shimmering in uncertain gold. One of them, I noticed, had been recently polished by Alan Trevor, fellow in classical studies. I did not remember anyone polishing it. I thought of his widow, of the letter she had kept blank except for his name, and of the single word I had seen faintly impressed beneath it, Vale. A farewell and a man's name bound together by coincidence, or perhaps confession. The Greeks understood such symmetry better than we ever could. Lewis had once asked me what I thought the truth looked like. I'd told him it looked like a contradiction, a statement that refutes itself and yet remains undeniable, like a man who dies for a faith he no longer believes. In the corner of the chapel, beneath the lectern, I found the hymn book open to Abide With Me. It had been there before, weeks ago, underlined faintly in pencil. This time, though, there was something new. A sheet of paper, folded once, slipped between the pages. The same handwriting as Vale's. The ink faded, the words brittle with restraint. Forgive me not for what I did, but for what I allowed. No date, no name, only the quiet finality of someone writing to a conscience that no longer answered. I replaced it where I'd found it. To keep it, I felt, would be theft not of evidence, but of repentance. Outside, the fog had thickened. The towers of All Souls rose and vanished in the same breath. I heard the slow tread of footsteps behind me, the porter again, perhaps, or memory. When I turned, there was no one. Back in my room that night, I poured myself the last of a bottle I'd been saving for reasons that had never seemed urgent. The fire had gone out hours earlier, leaving the air sharp and clean. I took out my notebook and opened it to the final page, the one reserved for endings that refused to end. I wrote only 3 lines. He sought mercy in silence. He found it in deceit, and I mistook both for the truth. Then I closed the book, as one might close the lid of a coffin. Somewhere beyond the city, a train moved through. The darkness, its whistle low, carrying its sound into places no one would ever listen. I imagined Vale at his desk, the candle burning down to the stub, the ink drying before he could finish the sentence that would have saved him. I imagined Trevor, his last thought not of guilt, but of fatigue. And I thought of myself still here, still listening to the long silence that follows every solved mystery. Because the truth, I've come to learn, never ends in revelation, only in the quiet that remains when everything worth saying has already been said.